For our next topic, we're going to talk about the best practices in collaborative conservation philanthropy. We have two speakers. Tim Stevens is a fund advisor for Montana and veterans at the Candida Fund.
Close, yeah, Candida, yeah.
Candida, thank you. And John Sanderson is the director of the Center for Collaborative Conservation at Colorado State. Tim, John, and 16 other workshop participants published a paper recently on a topic which you can find at this link that I will post in the chat right now. And Tim and John are going to share their thoughts about the key messages in the paper and answer any questions that anyone may have. So I'll hand it off.
Thank you, Audrey. And Taylor, that was actually a nice setup for us because I mean, it's no accident, right, that funding and fundraising is focus of what we're talking about here today. We don't have much of a presentation, but I'm going to share just a little bit just to orient you all to what we did and why you might find it useful. And we'd love to, mostly Tim and I'm going to kind of orient you to what we did. I'm going to hand it over to Tim, who is going to offer his perspective on this work that we did together, and particularly what he would like, what he sees as the most valuable pieces of this workshop we did in the paper that we published. And I'll do the same thing. And then we are intending to, as we just did with Taylor, leave about I don't know, 10 or maybe even a little bit more minutes at the end of this presentation to be able to interact with all of you and ask any questions that, or answer, talk about any questions you have. It was the fall of 2021. So in that first summer, the second summer of the pandemic, when we got a little reprieve from COVID, and I saw a request for proposals from a journal. The journal is Conservation Science and Practice, that I'm sure many of you know and look at occasionally. And the request for proposals was ideas for papers that they might publish on conservation philanthropy, meaning private investment in conservation. And I got the idea, working with some of my advisors and colleagues in the Western Collaborative Conservation Network, to do a workshop where we bring together both practitioners, which most of you, maybe all of you, are practitioners, with the exception probably of Tim and Rich. And I know Casey does some funding, but most of the people who participate in the WCCN are practitioners, very interested in this question of where we get funding. But I also wanted to bring in funders, and so to have a dialogue between funders and practitioners. And what we ended up doing is bringing together 8 funders, 8 practitioners, and 2 of us from the Center for Collaborative Conservation facilitated a day-and-a-half workshop. And the intention of the workshop was to see if we could reach agreement on how we should do philanthropy together in the space that we call collaborative conservation. What we ended up with, I'm going to show you just a, let me see here. I am going to show you just a couple of items here in a PowerPoint. So this one, the first thing I wanted to show you is, oops, let me get rid of that, is this is the paper itself, is Best Practices for Collaborative Conservation Philanthropy. the link is at the bottom of this slide, which is probably not live for you, but the live link is in the chat. And so you're welcome to, of course, look at that. It's open access, so anyone can reach it. And then what I'm going to very briefly share with you is just what those practices are. And they are these are the 8 best practices that we came up with. And you'll see that quite a few of the things are things that you all do around collaboration and relationships. We've already talked a bit about investing in capacity. And there are a couple of things on here that have not yet come up in today's conversation. And I might speak to a couple of those. Tim might speak to a couple of those. And in the paper itself, what you'll find is we describe this best practice, but we worked really hard to bring the view of both funders and practitioners to the best practice, to whether it's collaborate or nurture relationships, etc. What does that look like from a funder's perspective? What does it look like from a practitioner's perspective? And very critically, how do we bring those different perspectives together to make fundraising for collaborative conservation less transactional and more relational? So I'm going to pause there. I'm going to pass it over to my friend Tim, who works up in Montana and as an advisor for the Candida Fund. I'm going to ask Tim to share some of his thoughts on the workshop and the paper, but very critically, just in this space of collaborative conservation philanthropy, what stands out, Tim, as what you think in your experience is particularly important for us to pay attention to and think about and nurture as we go about our work? So, Tim?
That's me. Hi. Hey, I don't have any slides for you, so sorry, but I don't. But great to be here. And first of all, thank you all for your hard work on behalf of Large Landscapes and the West. It's tough work, and it's in the trenches, and it is appreciated by me and the rest of the world. So thank you first and foremost, and thanks for taking the time to sit in on this. Just because, I mean, the only other person I know than John this call is Ethan. I'll just give you a little bit of my background, which is I am an alumni of CSU. That's where I graduated from. That gave me my launch. And back in the day when the fax machine was the big thing, so way back when. But and back when it was the College of Forestry and Natural Resources, so they struck the forestry at some point. But I worked for the National Wildlife Federation after I graduated CSU for about 5 years as an organizer. Then moved up to Montana in '94. And worked for the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, which is a regional conservation group, for about 10 years. Then jumped from GYC in 2004 and launched the Yellowstone Field Office for the National Parks Conservation Association. And then became the regional director for NPCA, and I managed a 4-state region of Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and North Dakota. So, and then in 2015, I jumped in and went to work for Candida, and spun up the Montana portfolio, as well as a portfolio focused on supporting veterans and veteran serving organizations, and then a portfolio focused on democracy and civic engagement. So kind of spread myself around to those areas. And my area of funding is just within the state of Montana, and we are actually on a spend out. So the Candida Fund will be closing our doors at the end of this year, which has been a real interesting ride. So anyways, with that, I again appreciate the opportunity, and again, John asked me to kind of reflect on the practices that we discussed in our gathering in Fort Collins here a couple of years ago now, and to maybe flag a few that just struck me as most critical to consider, and provide a little bit more depth and some thoughts and feedback for you. And hopefully it's not all stuff you've heard before. But and just in saying that, the caveat is that after reading the paper again the other day, it really does cover some really important and good topics that are still point on. And so I'd urge you to read the whole thing, actually, if you haven't yet. But I just want to flag a few things, and Audrey, as facilitator, you can like wave your hand at me if I go on too long. So no sweat there. But I feel like all these topics are like a nested Russian doll that you open it up, and then each one of them is a 2-hour long conversation if you really want it to be. So I'll just try and skip off the top of the waves with a few that kind of touched me. So the first one is around relationships, and I mean, you all do that every day, but I think kind of the way I kind of broke this down is into buckets, and the first sort of set of relationships are obviously funder and practitioner. And it's not just around building relationships, but quality relationships. And our group agreed that with well-developed relationships, a lot of pitfalls can be avoided. And on the practitioner side, better relationships can help grantees avoid feeling like a gun for hire from the funder. And I'm sure you've all experienced this before, like you've had to do a little dance around your program to get the funding, or you've had to stray from your core work to bring funding in the door to put food on the table. On the funder side, there's a feeling that we need to get away from feeling like we're just the bank and that we're just there to write the checks, and instead want more of substantive interactions with grantee partners. So we agree that the best way to deal with these and the challenges involved is through the development of solid grantee funder relationships. And just to read from the report, and I don't know if this is just what you just put up there or not, but I'm just going to read it because it was so good, which is to nurture relationships, practitioners and funders should be deliberate about tracking their most vital relationships and employ a range of methods to stay in touch, including personal emails and phone calls, meals together, social events, organized field trips, newsletters, and social media. And I guess, first of all, this is a two-way street, and the burden should not all be on practitioners. And it's also a topic of bigger conversation. But I think, and the only thing I'd flag here is that sentence sounds like a whole lot of work, frankly. But there are ways to be efficient with that and sort of build it in to a system. And once you have it sort of built into a system, it's kind of a little bit of care and feeding, but it's important to have it as a system. So the second area of sort of building relationships are the relationships between organizations. And it sounds like you got it nailed in Texas, but if it's a win if multiple groups approach a funder with a well thought out strategy and clearly defined goals and budget that's shared amongst many partners. And especially in these days, and I don't know what it's like in other parts of the country. I think it's a little bit the way in Montana, certainly is here, as well as maybe Colorado, which is, you've got groups with overlapping missions. And it's tough as a funder to, if somebody's working on bison, there's 20 groups working on bison, and then you get 20 phone calls asking to fund similar work. And there's been great value in organizations that have overlapping missions to join together to figure out who's going to do what, to put together a comprehensive plan, and then go to a funder as sort of one group and maintain that relationship as a coalition. So, and then thirdly and lastly, there's the funder to funder relationships. And this, as it sounds like, this is on us. And it really is critical that funders work together to better understand and efficiently fund the nonprofit infrastructure. Closer funder relationships can lead to reduced grant writing burdens and reporting burdens for grantees, pooled funding focused on specific geographic or issue priorities, and also a different level of commitment to geographies on issue areas and issue areas. And I'll just flag that, here in Montana, a couple of years ago, we started up the Montana Conservation Funders Network, which has now about 25 funders that are involved. And we get together on a regular basis to learn, to connect with grantees, to get out on the ground. We're actually planning an Indigenous conservation field trip here this next summer. And it's just been a way to, frankly, my hope is to, reel in new funding to Montana, because we're leaving and we're one of the bigger funders in the state. But beyond that, it's been a great place to nurture relationships and make phone calls about, hey, what do you know about this group, et cetera. So that's really on us, and that really needs to develop. And I know that there's other states that have that as well. And I don't know the depth, because this is all the only place where I work. So The next one I want to hit on a little bit is investing in capacity, and I segment that up into both human resources, investing in the people that you got, and building on that human capital, and also building professional skills. And I think just overall, and we know this, but the reality is that there always has been, and there always will be, more organizational capacity needs than the money that there is to support them. We just can't solve the problem by increasing funding, although that's part of the equation. It's just not going to happen. I think in the area of building human capacity and skills and et cetera, the capacity for an organization to sort of develop and mature. There's been a lot of real interesting talk that I've been a part of, and I've seen about how groups can work efficiently together to collectively reduce capacity needs through shared positions. We've seen things as simple as shared office space, and in some cases through combining organizations that have mission overlap. And that was something that was raised in the plan that is a little bit more difficult, but it's in the places where I've seen it, it's worked. The second part of this is building the capacity of existing staff. And there is some interesting work that organizations and funders have both been exploring to help build the skills and staff capacity. And I'm just going to mention a few of them. There's pooled efforts across a coalition of groups. And a few years ago, and Ethan, this was before your time, but MWCC and an organization called Future West put together a capacity building program. And they raised a pot of money, and they put together trainings for organizations that were defined. The trainings were defined by the participating organizations. It's like, we need this. Those trainings were put together, and they brought in the right experts to provide the capacity building trainings, and then also provided the small groups, and these were mostly like watershed groups, a small grant out the door to help them implement whatever it is that they wanted to implement as a result of the training. So that's one model, and thankfully, really what's emerged over the past maybe 5 years is there are now inexpensive, or oftentimes even free, capacity building training options now that didn't exist a while back. And those include, and I'll just flag a few of them here. There's an organization called Candid. Have you guys ever heard of them? They were formed by the merging of GuideStar and the Foundation Center. And it's got a whole learning program that they offer free or very cheap trainings for organizations. And I sat in on one a year ago just to see what it was like, and it's really top notch. And so Candid is the name of that outfit. There's also the state nonprofit associations, like the Montana Nonprofit Association, for example, and I know that Colorado's got one as well, and I don't know about the other states in the Intermountain West, but like Montana Nonprofit Association puts on a ton of great and free trainings to members, and a quick look at the Colorado Nonprofit Association seems to have the same thing, and hopefully we can start tapping into those resources as opposed to having to find our own to do these. And then lastly, I'll just mention the community foundations, like here in Park County, which is where I live, just north of Yellowstone. The Park County Community Foundations has, and it's, it's a county of 15,000 people, and the Park County Community Foundations has a really nice training series for nonprofits. And I see your 5-minute warning, so I'm tracking right with you there. So the other one that really struck me was plan well and implement well. And really there's a real premium in understanding organizations that have a plan, not only for the organization, but for the programs and the campaigns that they are involved with. And I mean, we're all program people, right? We like to roll up our sleeves and do program, but with a modest amount of focused time on setting up an organization right through strategic planning, fiscal tracking, organizational policies, board guidance, a lot of the unsexy stuff. It not only sets the organization up well, but importantly shows that a group is well organized and ready to go and ready to receive funding. Again, reading from the paper, it says practitioners should ensure their organization creates a strategic plan that contains values, vision, mission, and theory of change. The plan should articulate strategies or specific actions, anticipated outcomes, and methods for measuring outcomes and impact. On the funder side, funders need to fund these activities if we expect to see them and also drop this notion of trying to put an unrealistic cap on overhead in grant requests. This is sort of one of my pet peeves, but funders need to better understand that part of our job as funders is to help organizations keep the lights on. So the last thing I'll mention, and then I'll almost be right on time for you, is the entrepreneurial spirit. And this has got to be a dance between funders and grantees, right? Like funders have to indicate that we don't expect 100% success, and that we need to be funding risks and trying new things, and we need to celebrate. If something doesn't work out, let's dig into it and figure out why. And grantees and organizations need to think, need to be able to be willing to take those steps and to take those risks, and with the knowledge that it may or may not work out. And so this is one that we really need to do together. So anyways, each of these areas is a long conversation, but overall, I really think the paper nailed it in terms of best practices, and I'm happy to chat with you about any of these. So anyways, yeah, thanks for the time.
Yeah, I think I'll keep this pretty brief. That was awesome, Tim. Thank you. What I noted in the chat, under the fundraising superpower, there are quite a few people who indicated that you don't yet have a superpower, and you're in a stage where you're still growing your own fundraising ability. And I think one of the key things I want to share from my work in this workshop, working with Tim and Rich, who is also on this call, and the other, both funders and practitioners. And I'll note that both Rich and Tim, you can tell from Tim's history, the way he described it, they've both spent quite a lot of time in the practitioner space as well, both seeking funding for organizations and giving funding. But what I wanted to, the particular perspective I wanted to share was that I was frankly astonished as I was putting together this workshop at how eager the funders were to have this conversation. And I think historically, many of us think about funding, private funding, as Tim mentioned, as more transactional, where we're the hired gun, and as Tim said, they're the ones who are expected to fund all the work. But on both sides of that equation, what I've learned is that not only is building the kind of relationship Tim described really important to all this work that we're doing, but both sides of the relationship want that. Both sides of this relationship want to be in that relationship. And so particularly for those of you who are not familiar with working with funders and private funders and foundations, very much encourage you to lean into that. And this theme of relationship permeates that entire paper. There's one other thing that I will say around this invest in capacity, since that came up during Taylor's call, and Tim mentioned it again. On one hand, yes, as Tim said, funders have an obligation to invest in capacity. And I know from a lot of conversations I've had with both private and public funders that the funders know that nonprofits need staff capacity. We all know that. What is less obvious is that, as Taylor pointed out, I think that we've got to deliver. So to that point of plan well and execute well, one of the best practices, and Tim spoke to this as well, we need to build that trust. And the trust is both staying in touch, but it's also demonstrating that we have our act together, and demonstrating that we can take that capacity that we're asking people to invest in and put it to really good use to deliver conservation outcomes, because ultimately that's what we're after on both sides of this funder and practitioner relationship, those conservation outcomes.